first very important presentation here, Sheryl has.
I'm not afraid of you. Thank you. So hi, I'm Sheryl, and like was said, I am a master's candidate at Northern Illinois. So today I'd like to share with you my research on dung beetle functional traits related to some of the restoration management practices here in the tallgrass prairie. So as you might have heard or seen from some of the posters today, a lot of the focus on restoration is the vegetative community. That's what we're able to actively restore, whether it's planting the species that we do want to have there, or physically, or through things like prescribed burning, removing species that we don't want to be here. But that is not the whole picture. We do need to focus on other organismal groups like Sean mentioned in his presentation. And one of the ways to sort of more holistically examine the effects of the restoration management is through this group of functional traits, which are basically characteristics of organisms that allow them to interact with their environment and perform some ecosystem functions that I'll get to in a moment. So here at Nachusa, my research is part of the Refuge project that Kirsty referenced this morning. So as part of the Refuge project, we are looking at the reintroduction of bison and the use of prescribed fire and their effects on a lot of different organismal groups. And we are also working in sites that are a part of a chronosequence, so all the way from the Holland Farm site, which is about 4 years old, all the way up to West Heinkel and the main unit, and even using the main remnant as a reference site. So I'm looking at the effects of the age of the site, and also the reintroduction of the bison and the use of prescribed fire on the dung beetles. So ecosystem functions. There are a lot of different ways that an ecosystem functions, or things that are functioning within an ecosystem. Some examples might be primary productivity. This is what's happening in the vegetative community as the plants grow. Also pollination services like Sean just shared with us, lots of different insects interacting with the vegetative community. But the functional traits and groupings that I'm interested in are those of the dung beetle community. So dung beetles, as you might suppose, are really instrumental in the function of decomposition in an ecosystem, also nutrient cycling and fertilization that goes along with that decomposition of dung, and sometimes also the function of soil rotation. So my research has two basic objectives. First, I'm interested in determining how those restoration management practices like prescribed fire and the reintroduction of the bison are changing the dung beetle communities themselves. And then the second objective is to look at how the dung decomposition rate is affected by those restoration management practices and by whatever dung beetle community is present in each site. So I'm going to take a sidebar for a moment and introduce you to the stars of my research. These are the dung beetles. So right up here in the center is Onthophagus hecate. I'm sorry, none of these have common names. Insect world. But Onthophagus hecate is the most common species that we have here at Nachusa. They are present in every site that I have sampled in. And these are sort of smallish beetles. You can probably fit one of them on your pinky fingernail. And these are what we call the tunnelers, or one of the groups of tunnelers that we have here. Most people, when they picture dung beetles, think about a beetle rolling a ball of elephant dung across the savanna. We don't have elephants here at Nachusa, and we also don't really have many roller dung beetles. Instead, we have a lot of these tunnelers. So they'll actually, the adults will take dung from a dung pat once it's dropped by a bison, dig a tunnel under that dung pat, and pull the dung down into the tunnel. They'll lay their eggs next to the dung. The larvae hatch out and consume the dung, and then they'll emerge from the tunnel once they're adults. So these hecate are the most common tunnelers that we have here at Nachusa. To the left, you'll see Onthophagus knausi, and they are remarkably similar to the hecate in a lot of their body structure, but they are about an order of magnitude smaller. So if you can fit one hecate on your pinky fingernail, you can probably fit two knausi there. So they're quite a bit smaller, but they are tunnelers in approximately the same way. And then the other three sort of larger tunnelers that we have here, we have Geotrupes opacus and Copris minutus. We find a lot of Copris minutus earlier in the season and a lot of the Geotrupes later in the season. But I'm sure that your eyes have already been drawn up to the Phanius vindex here in the top corner. They are by far the most beautiful of all the dung beetles that we have here. and these are often referred to as rainbow scarabs because of this rather striking iridescent green and orange. You'll also see this is a female and then a male over here on the other side. So males of most of the dung beetle species, especially socially dominant males, will have a pronounced horn coming off of their face at some point, but the horn on the major males of Phanius vindex is often very dramatic, like the one in this photo. We also have one other group of dung beetles here from a different behavioral guild. These have all been tunnelers, but the ones down here in the corner are what we call dwellers. And I have them just listed to genus because the Aphodius beetles are maybe even a little smaller than the Knausi, so very, very tiny. And they're difficult to identify the species unless you're an expert, which I am not. So we're just going to lump them into their genus group. But these are dwellers. Just like the name implies, the adults dwell directly in the dung pat that's been dropped by the bison with their larvae. So basically the entire sort of life of this insect takes place in that dung pat. So with all of these beetles, I'm looking at several different functional traits, both physiological functional traits and behavioral functional traits. For the physical functional traits, I'll be drying all of the beetles that I catch to a consistent weight and then weighing them. I'm also looking at the width of their pronotum, so that's the sort of shield-like structure here directly behind the head of the insect, so I'm looking at the width of the pronotum. And then also the elytra, those are the hard shell-like covers over the wings on the back of the insect. Both the length and the width of the elytra. And some of those body measurements will help us think about the mobility of these insects. Stands to reason, larger insects are more able to disperse or fly between sites, and that might be something that comes into play as we look at some of the trends. We're also going to be measuring the length of their femur, or the largest segment of one of the hind legs, and then we'll calculate some ratios between all of those physiological measurements. We're also looking at some behavioral functional traits, as I said. So the behavioral guild, whether the insects are tunnelers or dwellers. We don't have any absolutely confirmed rollers here at Nachusa yet, but if we were to discover some, that would be really interesting and add some more diversity to our functional grouping. We're also looking at the deal activity, so whether these insects are nocturnal or diurnal, and also their habitat specificity. There's a lot of evidence that when bison were removed from most of their historic range in the United States, the dung beetles disappeared with them. So any dung beetles that were specific to bison may no longer exist. So we assume that most of the dung beetles we're finding here are generalists, but if any of them were specific to the prairie or specific to the bison, that would add some extra diversity to the way this community is functioning.
So if we found a dung beetle rolling a piece of dung, you have not seen that with any of those species?
No.
So we need to take pictures.
Yes, and catch it and kill it for me.
I can do that.
But don't squash.
No, don't squish it. So everyone here is pretty much familiar with the layout of Nachusa, but this is just a map to give you an idea of the sites that are being used by that Refuge research project. So all of our specific sampling sites, or where our research grids are located, are indicated in the pink dots here, and then the red hatching is showing the sites that were burned this year. I believe this site ignores Franklin Creek down here at the bottom, but we'll just pretend it's there. So for the research grids, here in the center we have those 5x5 grids that Kirsty told you about this morning, and inside those grids is where the small mammal sampling and some vegetative surveys take place. We didn't want my experiments to conflict or interact with anything that was going on there, so all of my research takes place around the perimeter of the research grids. And first, I'd like to draw your attention to these two opposite corners and the sets of circles. Those are indicating my pitfall traps. So a pitfall trap is basically a series of cups filled about halfway with some diluted antifreeze, placed in a hole in the prairie with the lip of the cup even with the top of the soil, so that as the insects walk along, they fall into the cup, drown in the liquid, and then we can process them later in the lab. And this is a picture of what one of the collected cups looks like. So it's full of dead bugs. So we have 2 baited traps per site. The baited traps are indicated by the brown circles here. And 8 unbaited traps, so 4 unbaited traps surrounding each of the baited traps for a total of 10 traps per site. We had the traps open for one 4-week session from May to June. another 1-week session in July, and another 1 week in September, just because, like I said earlier, some of the species emerge a little later in the season, and we wanted to get a complete picture of who all is out there in the prairie. So again, looking at my site layout, I also had these sets of squares, and those are my decomposition experiment. So I added 12 pats of dung surrounding each site, so 3 on each side, and the gray squares indicate the controls. These were dung pats that were completely enclosed in a wire mesh cage. The wire mesh was so fine that it excluded access from any dung beetles or other arthropods, but those controls were to show us the decomposition rate or the mass loss from the dung based on dehydration and also any microbial activity. The other 8 pats in each site look like the one that you see here. It's just some dung on top of a wire platform, and that was left accessible to the dung beetles so that they could take the dung away or lay their eggs in it or whatever. In this picture, you can actually see this hole in the center is evidence of one of those larger dwellers that I showed you, so probably one of the Copris minutus or maybe that rainbow scarab. So they dug a tunnel down through and pulled some of the dung down under the ground. And then all of this over here is actually disturbed soil. So this is where we get that soil turnover or rotation function in the ecosystem, is actually because of these tunneler dung beetles. So again, all of these dung pats were left in the sites for about 4 weeks in May and June, and we masked them several times while they were out there, starting at 5, 8, 11, and 15 days. We did actually continue to weigh them after that, but there was a rain event that made all of the dung swell back up because it regained all of that water it had been losing, and that made our data crunching a little funky, so we decided just to stop at the 15-day mark. So what did I learn from all of that? Well, if we look at the total abundance of the dung beetles, and all of this data is very preliminary, it takes a long time to sort through all of the bugs that we capture. So these are all data just from the first time that I collected insects out of the traps. You can see the total abundance of the index here along the side, and then the different treatments for the sites along the bottom. So some sites where the bison have access but were not burned this year, sites where the bison do have access and they were burned this year, sites without bison that were burned this year, and then the sites that don't have bison and were not burned this year. But even though there's a little bit of height difference, none of these are significantly different, which seems like good news because the dung beetle abundances do not seem to be negatively impacted by the use of the prescribed fire. And also the sites that don't have bison still seem to have a fairly robust dung beetle community. This is probably because of that sort of larger landscape context. If you think about Nachusa, there are lots of agricultural areas around here, and some of them are pasture land with sheep and cattle, and those probably serve as reservoirs of dung beetle populations. So when new dung becomes available in Nachusa, the beetles are able to fly or crawl over into these sites and perform their decomposition.
Well, what about, deer and coyote? Don't they do that kind of dung, or no?
That's actually something that I'd love to look at for my doctoral research, so yes. I would love to talk with you about that more later. Yeah, so there are some places where there might be reservoirs for their population, but it seems like the treatment of the site does not seem to have much of an effect on the overall abundance of the dung beetles. Similarly, site age also does not seem to have much of an effect on the total abundance. This is the main remnant over here, but even some of the younger sites have just as many or maybe even more dung beetles in them. So it looks like as soon as the site sort of looks and starts to act like a prairie again, the dung beetles are right there ready to go and do their thing. So doesn't seem to be any effect of age on the population, at least at this point in the data analysis. But there is something interesting going on with that smallest tunneler that I told you about before, that Onthophagus knausi. Their population does seem to be affected by the presence of the bison, and again, this might be explained by their limited mobility because they are so much smaller. Sites that have bison have many more knausi than sites that do not have bison, which is sort of interesting. But these tiny beetles just may not be able to go to the sites that don't have bison, or it's not worth it to them to go there because there isn't enough resource. But in a place where there is a lot of resource, their population jumps up. There's also something interesting happening with the Onthophagus knausi and the site age. If we include the main remnant in our analyses, we get this trend line that makes it look like older sites might have more Knausi in them. But if we exclude the main remnant, all of a sudden all of that significance goes away. So there doesn't really seem to be a clear pattern of the age of the site affecting the Omphagus knausi population. But again, I have many more bugs to sort through, so we'll see. So that second experiment with the dung decomposition, get these very nice decomposition curves. The days we weighed them again were 5, 8, 11, and 15. And up the vertical axis is the proportion of the dung mass that was lost over all of those days. So each of the site treatments, again, with and without bison, with and without fire, those did not seem to have an overall effect on the proportion of dung that was lost. They seemed to trend very similar to one another and end up at almost the exact same point by the end of our sampling. So again, seems like once it looks and acts like a prairie, even if the bison aren't there, there are going to be dung beetles that will come in and make use of that resource when it is available. Same thing again with the site age. Even the very young sites had just as much or maybe even more decomposition than the two remnant sites. This is the main remnant and the Thelma Carpenter remnant. So yeah, fire, keep doing it, bison, doesn't matter. And that's pretty much what we were able to determine, at least with these preliminary data. The dung beetle communities don't seem to be disrupted by any of the management techniques, so prescribed fire every other year doesn't seem to harm them in any way, probably because they are a little bit mobile. And even if the bison do not have access to a site, that's okay. We understand that it's not feasible to give the bison access to everywhere, but the dung beetles are able to sort of move between the sites when there's resource available for them. But some of the species, especially the smaller ones like the Knausi and maybe also those Aphodius dwellers that I talked about, may change in their abundance depending on whether or not there's a lot of resource available because of the presence of the bison. And also the ecosystem function, which is what we ultimately care about. We want this to be acting like a prairie, even if it is a restoration. The ecosystem function of decomposition does not seem to be disrupted by the management techniques either. So where would I like to go with my research? I need to sort through the rest of the insects that I trapped, so that is what I'm going to be doing. I have about 6 weeks left of dung beetles to sort through, so we'll see if anything else jumps out at us as we continue to sort through them and also take some of those extra physiological measurements that I mentioned at the beginning to look for more trends. I'm also going to be repeating that same trapping scenario again next summer to further support what we've learned, and we'll also be repeating the dung decomposition experiment next summer to support the trends that we noticed. I would like to thank so much Bill and Cody and everyone who manages Nachusa. Thank you for setting this up in an experimental design for us because it's nice to look at sites with and without different treatments, and thank you for putting up with us while we do research out in your prairie. I'd also very much like to thank the Friends of Nachusa for helping to fund my research. I bought wire to make my platforms and my cages and lots of plastic cups and antifreeze because of your generous funding and support. And I'd like to thank the Barber and Jones Lab graduate and undergraduate students. Thank you for scooping poop with me, guys. And now I'll be happy to take any questions.
On the bigger scarabs down in Florida, and each female went down, dug her tunnel and laid only one egg. Is that true of these two? They just do one egg?
That is an awesome question. Unfortunately, there is very limited literature on most of these species, so unless I go out and collect it for myself, I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, there does seem to be quite a lot of variation in the different species, how many eggs they lay, whether just mom takes care of providing for them or sometimes dad helps out. There are even some species that instead of digging their own tunnel and finding their own dung will actually steal a dung in a tunnel from others. So yeah, there's quite a lot of variation in the way the species interact. Yeah.
How long is the life cycle of these?
Similar answer, unfortunately. There's quite a bit of variation, but not a whole lot of literature. Like I said, most of the dung beetles that we're looking at don't even have a common name. There they are. Yeah, most of them don't even have a common name, so there isn't a whole lot about them. The Phanius vindex is probably the most well-studied of all of these, maybe because it's charismatic, maybe because it's big enough to be able to find a lot of them. But yeah, all of these need a lot more research in order to be able to answer all those questions. Yeah.
Is the range known? How
I hate to keep giving you the same answer, unfortunately. Yeah, we don't know. Some of the literature says that the Knausi is incredibly rare, but we found them in about half to 2/3 of the sites that we researched. So,
One more.
yep.
Predators?
Other arthropods, so some of the ground beetle predators and spiders and things like that. I imagine also, birds and other things that eat insects. Yeah.
You had dung that was caged so that arthropods couldn't get at it.
Yes.
Was that in your graph too?
Yeah.
That was the control.
So you're looking at this? This.
Yeah.
Yes. So, no. This is just these are just the platforms and their decomposition rates. We had the controls, but there were some issues perhaps with the materials used to make the controls, and there was not a whole lot of, there was a lot of variation in how the controls wound up decomposing. So I chose to not show you the decomposition rates from the controls because it would have made for a rather confusing graph to look at.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is do we need the dung beetles out there now that we have ice in here, or will the dung disappear anyway?
So that was sort of inconclusive based on what we were able to do, which is again why we want to replicate the experiment and sort of refine our sampling methods to maybe get a clear answer to that question. Yeah.
So one thing you talked about was maybe soil being brought up. Are you measuring it all? The amount of soil mixed in with the dung?
I have not, but there are some other studies that have looked at that, yeah, and how that might change things.
How many other critters are using the dung? I know you said that you have identified all the ballpark figures.
So there is some evidence that there might also be dung-breeding flies using the dung, and also sometimes earthworms. But in some other studies that have looked at the effect of all of those groups, it looks like dung beetles, especially the tunnelers and the rollers, have the largest effect in terms of dung removal and decomposition.
Is there a range map on beetles within the state of Illinois, like presence, absence, like if there's any other location where rollers are known to be?
Yeah, unfortunately, not a lot of people have been looking at these guys, especially in North America. There's a lot of dung beetle research in Africa, Australia, and even in Europe for some reason. But North America is kind of unclaimed territory, so yeah.
How fresh or stale must the dung be?
That's a great question. So they actually prefer the fresher the better in terms of the moisture content, because that makes it easier for the adults to sort of dig through it, but not too wet, because if it's too wet, the eggs might sink and not sort of stay suspended in the content. But also because if it's fresher, it smells stronger, right? And since this resource is very patchy, it's sort of in random places all over the prairie, and it's not always there, so it's patchy both spatially and in time. So the fresher it is, the more it smells, and the easier it is for the dung beetles to find it in the first place.
Is that why they're antenna or maybe like that?
Yeah, a lot of beetles have very distinct antennae shape, but yeah, definitely for chemoreception.
Beetles?
Right. Sorry.
So not necessarily just here, but in any of the literature on dung beetles, are any of them prefer certain types of species poop? Like
yes.
Okay.
Did Kirsty walk away already? Yeah. So she and I have actually been looking at wanting to discover the preferences in a lot of places, especially in subtropical areas. Dung beetles actually tend to prefer omnivore dung. A lot of research actually uses human dung as one of the baits. So yeah, a lot of them do tend to prefer omnivore dung. We just sort of went with the bison dung because that's the greatest amount of resource here, and we're going to assume that since bison are sort of the largest dung producers on this continent, that would be a good place to start. But there's a chance that they might actually prefer a coyote or some other omnivore over the bison. Yeah. Was there another? Yeah, John.
Do you have any suggested common names for some of these? The Nachusa dung beetle?
I have to think about that. So we look at, like I said, the Knausi and the Hecate are very similar looking. The only real difference is their size unless you put them under a microscope. And then one of them has bumps on the pronotum, that shield area, and one has divots, which not much of a difference. But I've decided that the bumps kind of remind me of strawberry seeds, so maybe we could do something with that. Anybody else?
On a sidebar, I once saw a vulture sort of popping up from the top of the hill, and I was wondering what it was after. So I went down to see if something had died, and it had clearly been poking holes in a big bison pattern. The beak hole in there, and it flew away when I got there. So it was trying to bite some kind of bug in there.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
The vultures don't eat the dead things.
And it's a good note, the dung beetles don't just eat poop either. There's lots of evidence that dung beetles also eat carrion like a vulture would, and sometimes even mushrooms for some reason. So they sort of do a lot of different kinds of decomposition.
And I swear I've seen a roller. I would give them one.
I was wondering if much is known about how the functional diversity of dung beetles differs between restored or native habitats, and like you mentioned, pastures might be a reservoir. Is it known if they sort of do the same thing in terms of the generalist species, no matter what the habitat is?
Yeah, and so there's some research on the functional diversity out of both South America and Australia, and it looks like that the restoration of those original habitats does seem to improve the functional diversity of the dung beetles. We'll have to see if that's also true for North America. Yeah.
Are you planning to incorporate any of that in like pasture lands around here? Or
I'm sorry?
Are you planning to look at any agricultural lands or pastures around here in your work, or are you just looking at the restored?
Not for this project as far as we've designed it, but as I expand into my doctoral research, I would like to look at things like that, yes.
Cool.
One last question? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.